We have Brianne Aul. She's the Senior Manager of Information Governance and Strategy and Operations at Morgan Lewis and Bockius. Previously, Ms. Aul was the Firmwide Records Senior Manager for Reed Smith since 2009, a position to which she was promoted after serving as Records Supervisor for the Pittsburgh office since 2006. Ms. Aul also serves as a past president of the Pittsburgh Chapter of ARMA and is a founding steering committee member of the Law Information Governance Symposium. Ms. Aul became a CRM in December of 2014, and Ms. Aul received her B.A. in English from the Pennsylvania State University in 2001. Her M.B.A. is from Waynesburg University and came in 2008. And let's see. Contact. And let's see. Brianne, are you available? Are you there?
I am, and hopefully you're seeing my screen now.
Let's see, I'm going to start that. I'm going to. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you should be able to see yours right now. Is everybody okay? Can you see Brianne's screen? Fantastic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Hutch, for that introduction. I did notice that you didn't put that I'm an aspiring singer, which I always put in all of my intro slides, and yet my husband makes me take that out for some reason. He doesn't agree that I should be an aspiring singer. I also put that I am a Penguins fan, and then I considered my audience and thought maybe I should strike that. And then I put it back because with the playoffs coming up, I thought maybe you would support us because we may not be in the same city, Philly, but we at least are in the same state. So in terms of the agenda today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the lessons that we learned from an IG perspective as it relates to the pandemic, how you can either implement your entire IG program or at least pieces of an IG program post-COVID, or to the extent that you already had an IG program in place, how you can improve upon it, and then how you can leverage remote working to further your IG efforts. As you heard from my background, my primary experience has been in law firms. So you'll see that most of what I have in here has a law firm flavor, but I hope for those of you who are not working in law firms, that you still get something out of it, because I appreciate we have a lot of the same, let's say, shared challenges and opportunities. So we learned a whole host of things from the pandemic, but in terms of IG, I think we learned a lot of great key points. Number one, information has to be accessible to our entire organization 24/7 across the globe. And that real estate needs are really flexible. So all of that beautiful real estate that your company may have suddenly becomes a bit of a burden when you think about the fact that most offices over the past 2 years have been one's personal residence. I know it's blurry behind me, of course. This is my home office. Yesterday I was in my, let's say, real office, and I appreciate next week I'll be complete somewhere else. So again, real estate is really just based on the position of the person presenting. If you ask someone what hybrid means for them, you are going to get multiple answers. So I actually had a conversation with a few of my colleagues at other firms, and we all said that we are in a hybrid environment. But when we said, well, what does that mean? All three of us had a different definition. So for my firm, it's 3 days in, 2 days remote. You pick the days that you're remote. The other colleague said, we have a similar cadence in terms of days, but our firm is saying Mondays and Fridays, everybody's remote. Tuesday through Thursday, everybody's in. The other colleague said, oh, hybrid for us means you come in when you need to and you stay home when you don't. So again, it's important to understand that even whatever your organization's definition of hybrid is, isn't necessarily the same as your customers or clients, and also your organization's definition of hybrid may be subject to change based on what's happening outside of your literal and virtual four walls. The right tool at a critical time is oh so priceless. I actually had rolled out an e-signature program at our firm at the very end of 2019. We had a few bites, but the initial response was what I would consider to be lukewarm. 6 months later, I was everybody's best friend. Everybody was using that program and saying that, it really helped them continue their particular business simply because it meant that they were able to get those very critical documents signed without having to wait for a tool to be identified, road tested, and implemented. So again, right tool, critical time, can't tell you how important that is. Automation is equally critical. I know that the prior speaker was talking about all of the challenges that certainly many of us are experiencing day to day in terms of staffing, resources, etc. The more that you're able to automate, the less those other challenges, less of a headache, I should say, those other challenges become. And security, of course, is critical, always has been, always will be, but it needs to be scalable, especially as your information extends to people's residences and they are coming up with ways to address client and customer needs at an unprecedented time. Companies need to be able to pivot. They need to be able to change their business model at a moment's notice, not just to be able to thrive, but to survive. And we saw that certainly in the restaurant industry, where takeout became something that if a particular restaurant didn't already have in place, it ultimately became much more of a struggle for them to get a new customer base than for those that already had that takeout model, McDonald's, Wendy's, more fast food chains, if you will. And then last but not least, if you do not have established IG policies and procedures, people will find a way to work around what you want them otherwise to do and collaborate. So how do you implement your IG program, or how do you improve upon it? The next few slides you'll see on the left-hand side, that's more for those of you who say we're at the very infancy stages of our program. We have pieces or we have nothing at all. On the right-hand side, that may be more for those of you who say we've had a policy, a program in place for many years, even prior to the pandemic, but we're looking for ways to improve upon it. So let's start with our good and great friend policy. IG policies are absolutely important to establish an understanding of how people are to work within your organization. At the bare minimum, your policies should define what a record is, where it's to be stored, how it's to be secured, the mobility and portability requirements around it. So again, speaking from a law firm perspective, we define mobility as situations where a client may elect to transition from one law firm, your law firm, to another, meaning their data goes from your organization to another organization. Appreciate that's not unique to law firms, but again, that's how we define mobility versus portability, how people are using that data, data in motion, and ultimately how that data, or if that data, is allowed to be accessed outside of your infrastructure. Retention, which is self-explanatory, and then of course privacy requirements. Bearing in mind that privacy requirements are not just subject to change in and of themselves, but also the ones that apply to you as your staff start working in other states or countries. So from a post-pandemic perspective, certainly you need to look at those policies you may have already had in place and think of some of the following. How do your policies work in a hybrid environment? So for example, are people able to follow your policies if, for the most part, they are working from a remote location, their home office or somewhere else? Are there new tools that you put into place during the pandemic that now need to be part of your policies and need to be governed? E-signatures, as I mentioned, was a huge, huge opportunity for those organizations that didn't already have an e-signature tool in place. But Teams, of course, and other collaboration platforms became very critical and also widely used during the pandemic. E-notary and remote notary, especially the RON solutions that ultimately skyrocketed during the pandemic. Does your organization use those? And if so, where is that data being managed? Is it part of your policies? Resources and staffing. So if you are thinking of what do you need to launch an IG program, you certainly need resources available to do things like digitization, electronic records management, physical records management, and disposition. So there are multiple different ways that people have structured their IG organization. Some have data scientists, which are phenomenal. Some rely on other parts of their larger organization to do those types of tasks. And their specific organization is really focused on the management of records themselves. After the pandemic, it is absolutely important to look at your existing organization and decide whether you need to right size. And when I say right size, I am not saying that as a nice way of avoiding the term downsizing. I truly mean right size. It could be that you can or need to or should reduce staffing as it relates to certain tasks that are no longer needed. Maybe during the pandemic, you had a significant transition to digital records and you have a very large, let's say, traditional record staff that maybe you just don't need that number anymore. And it's unfortunate, but it may be the case. Alternatively, you may find that you need more staff, especially in offices that have more individuals working from them. I believe that the last speaker had mentioned this idea of people going to DC and then coming back to Pennsylvania. I know in my organization, the concept of living in a lower cost city, such as Pittsburgh, as opposed to New York, or even Philly for that matter, was very attractive to certain attorneys, or they moved back to Pittsburgh simply because they were born and raised here and they still had family here. So where before the pandemic, we were at a certain number of attorneys, we now have more attorneys. So it may mean that we have to reconsider how many individuals we need from an IG perspective based out of our Pittsburgh office. Transitioning of existing roles is also important. Going back to that example I mentioned, that maybe you had quite a bit of people focused on one aspect of your records program. So again, just to use an example, maybe focused more on traditional records management, storage, retrieval, what have you. Now, the flavor, the cultural flavor of your firm for programs such as electronic records management, not just in terms of digitization, but also making sure that records that are already inherently electronic are stored in the appropriate repositories. Maybe the flavor of that for your organization is much better than it was prior to the pandemic. So for those resources that you have doing one task, it may be an opportunity for them instead to do something different that adds more value to your organization. And of course, with that would be greater skills development, not just in terms of technology, especially new technology that was procured and used during the pandemic, but also opportunities for them to learn the impacts of certain regulations and other external factors on your IG program. As I mentioned earlier, privacy laws, especially in situations where your firewalls have now extended to a much larger aspect of the country than they were initially. And then, of course, leveraging existing resources from COVID. And by that, I mean not necessarily people that were part of your IG or records organization, but perhaps individuals within your company that have a little bit more free time, shall we say, or bandwidth, simply because their core role isn't required as much right now. And I think of people who may have been more reliant on face-to-face interactions that are now being done virtually. Is it an opportunity to use those particular resources as a means to beef up what you're able to provide from an IG perspective without costing your company additional money in terms of recruitment, salary, what have you? Digitization. So certainly from a bare minimum, a digitization program, in order to be successful and not cost a significant amount of money to your company, is coming up with the criteria in terms of when there is a cutoff. So for us, we certainly have no desire to go back many years and digitize documents that have been for closed matters or are close to their disposition eligibility. But we are looking to digitize documents that are for more active matters or for situations in which the retention period is significantly longer. So we have those particular pieces in our program, as should you, but we also look for and have scanning software that makes the process much easier to do, especially because we use a document management system, much like other law firms, to store our official matter record. In terms of post-pandemic, we are looking at other programs that were put in place during the past 2 years, including the mail scanning that had been done by our office services department as a means to say, well, if these documents are already being digitized as they come in the door, and there is no plans to cease that mail scanning program, even as our return to office measures begin to increase, there's an opportunity for us to incorporate that as part of our larger records digitization program and work with the recipients of that mail to say, okay, that's already scanned to you. Number one, can we get rid of the physical mailing legally? And then two, that digitized mail, where does it need to be stored if it is part of our either matter record or administrative record? And then, of course, using digitization as a service for people not to have to come into the office. So during the pandemic, we had a few attorneys who really needed to come in or wanted to come in because they had certain files that were sitting on their desk. We, from an IG perspective, said, rather than you coming in, why don't we digitize your matter record and then it's accessible to you right from your home? Attorneys were very happy with that opportunity, but that is something that we are also not ceasing as we go back into the office. So we know that there are attorneys who still intend to work from home, even if they're coming in a little bit more. So why not have your records accessible to you wherever you are, assuming they are not already electronic? So again, this is something that we continue to offer our attorneys as a means to say, rather than having to rely on the paper at all, regardless of what the outside world looks like, let's digitize it so that in the event you need it and you aren't within the office, you don't have to wait. Shredding. So most people on this call, I would suspect, already have a shredding program. You probably have a shredding vendor. They came a certain period of time, whether it be weekly, monthly, bi-weekly. Maybe that waned a little bit during the pandemic. Maybe it's starting to come back as people go back into the office. Maybe even have communications that have been sent out, or even shred-all programs. And when I say shred-all, I mean the ones that the programs that ultimately say anything that is getting discarded, assuming it's not a toiletry product, is going into your shred bin. We have a shred-all program in place, and admittedly, we had a few people who thought that meant we were bursting through their doors and doing a large sweep off their desk. In some situations, it would be great to do that, but no, what we really meant was anything that was being discarded was ultimately placed in the shred bin. So after the pandemic, residential shredding has become something that is still very much a desire for people as they work from home and continue to print. We are certainly looking for opportunities to reduce printing whenever possible, not just for IG benefits, but also just environmental sustainability, cost reduction, security, and risk mitigation. But ultimately, we do have people who still like their paper. So to that end, the residential shredding programs that we had in place during the pandemic will likely be something we continue to have in place as people work from their, again, personal residence. We are looking for opportunities, as should you, to review how often shredding needs to happen within your organization. I can tell you, for those of you who haven't yet formally reopened, prepare in advance that as people start to come in, they will come in with this great gusto to get rid of everything that's been collecting dust on their desk for the past 2 years. And then hopefully you start to see people back off and rely on what is already natively digital, as opposed to, again, continuing to print, and then shred. Looking for opportunities to extend your shredding services beyond just the paper. So again, as people have found other means or have been approved through other means to have content on more portable media, shall we say, you absolutely want to make sure that that's incorporated within your program. And to the extent that you didn't have Shred All in effect before because the cost was perhaps too much, consider implementing it now, knowing that, again, the amount that people are printing hopefully is less and less, especially within the literal four walls of your building. Offsite storage, much like shredding, I would be shocked if all of you didn't have an offsite storage program. Now, I appreciate vendor agnostic, et cetera. It may be that you were always looking for ways, even before the pandemic, to only use that program when absolutely necessary. So identifying opportunities for people to know when something should go to offsite storage versus when it should be maintained digitally, returned back to your client or customer, things of that nature. Now, after the pandemic, it could be that in some situations, your offsite storage program increases. And by that, I mean in situations where you have people who say, you know what, we want to get out of this very expensive real estate, but we've got a lot of paper. How can we make this happen quickly? It may be that your offsite storage is a solution, not the ideal solution, but certainly more cost effective than the expensive real estate that you currently occupy in a more expensive city. Looking for opportunities, of course, always to reduce offsite storage through digitization and disposition, but looking for potential services that your offsite storage vendor offers, such as the scan on demand programs, based on, of course, the security and risk flavor of your organization. And then establishing the scope of what should be archived in offsite storage versus not, especially as some of your groups or subgroups within your company may have had workflows and been reliant on, let's say, governing bodies who used to operate in more a paper-based format and now post-pandemic are in a more digital format, such that perhaps what was permissible prior to the pandemic as something for offsite storage should now be a candidate for digitization or native electronic record. Audits and accountability, making sure that you have your shredding audits in place, that the proper documents are being put in the shredding receptacle versus a recycling receptacle. Inventory audits, knowing what you have. And then outperm audits. This is something that we do to make sure that we don't pay for offsite storage for boxes that aren't going back. And then, of course, after the pandemic, we have incorporated a lot of audits as it relates to making sure we account for everything that people are bringing back in the office, but also making sure that they have done the appropriate procedures as it relates to the storage of electronic content in the right repository. Disposition, policies, schedules, workflows, resources. Again, as records practitioners, I know everybody is familiar with that. From a post-pandemic perspective, I can tell you that we have looked for opportunities to really extend our disposition team to include resources that weren't as heavily involved with the process to begin with. Our essential records personnel, for example, those who are in the office every single day, are much more involved in the retrieval, review, and subsequent disposition of materials. Whereas prior to the pandemic, we heavily relied on our established disposition team to do the program essentially soup to nuts. And then electronic signatures, looking for a tool. There are many tools out there, several that are considered kind of best of breed. Looking for opportunities to make sure your organization knows when they can use that tool versus not. But afterwards, making sure you also remind them that that tool still remains in place, and that as your organization presumably remains in a virtual format to some extent, that you still offer that particular software for them as well. So those are just some examples of what you can offer your organization as it relates to either implementing a program or improving your program. So the next question really is, how do you leverage remote working to further your information governance efforts? And there's a whole host of ways that you can do that. But the first thing I would suggest doing is promoting yourself. Where can you pat yourself on the back? For those of you who may have seen the show Will and Grace, and I'm talking about the original Will and Grace, not the reboot, Debbie Reynolds played the one character, Grace's mother. And whenever something would happen that Debbie Reynolds predicted, she would do an I told you so dance. So she would go, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so. So it's really cute. Look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. But in 2019, we had gone around promoting information governance to all of our offices, the importance of having access to content, even if you were not working within the four walls of your office. And we had some people who embraced it right away, and others who looked at us thinking, that'll never happen. Well, of course, during the pandemic, certainly we would never, ever, ever have wanted that particular situation to happen. But as it relates to remote work, it was, look, this is why we told you this is important. This is why you don't want to rely on things that you can't have access to at your virtual fingertips. So with that in mind, I would say take a moment to celebrate and promote the fuse. What did you already have in place? What policies were already established in terms of how people were expected to work that were able to be scalable to them working from their home offices for 2 years? Did you already have a digitization program in place such that information was already accessible to individuals as they work from home? Did you already have an e-signature tool such that you had that day one, as opposed to having to wait until you were able to identify a vendor, procure a vendor, implement, et cetera, et cetera? Did you already have collaboration tools? And to the extent that you did, were they already properly governed? Meaning that people have a good understanding of how they were to use that tool, what information could be stored in that particular tool versus not, or what they were expected to do if they were receiving certain information through that tool that wasn't in your system of record. Staffing. Did you already have a staffing model in place that allowed you to be flexible as it relates to the services that you were able to offer your core internal customers? How was your team able to pivot? Was the paper to digital transition already in place for many years, such that this was just kind of part of what you were already planning to do or how you already operated, or was this brand new? Maybe you already had policies that established the electronic record as the official record, meaning that people weren't printing that much to begin with. Maybe you already had IG policies and processes in place that accounted for situations in which people weren't going to be in the office to do certain tasks. And that's all wonderful because, again, it meant that March 2020 was not as much of an impact to your organization because of what you already put into place. What were new remote working processes that were already baked into your culture beyond what I just mentioned? E-signatures, of course, as I said, as my own example, really helped us because we had already introduced the flavor of having those tools available, such that it wasn't people, sitting around scratching their heads thinking, what are we supposed to do now? Where did client service not get impacted? Where did your clients, and when I say clients, I mean both external and internal, say you didn't miss a beat? And that was so important for us because we rely so heavily on you. So make sure that you celebrate internally within your team, pat yourself on your shoulder, but also make sure that those who are at the senior leadership level, to whatever extent you're able to get in front of them, are aware of the fact that, hey, this is why we had this in place, and look how we were able to quickly adapt and be flexible so that you didn't have to worry about us. You were able to worry about those other situations that, quite frankly, could not have been planned for. At the same time, you can't pat yourself on the back without also taking the time to acknowledge where things weren't as wonderful as they could have been. So acknowledging the adults. Where did client service get impacted? Where were you not as flexible as you could have otherwise been had you had a policy, technology, or process already in place? Where did you have to scramble to come up with new processes or workaround processes? Where was there scramble technology? I had never heard this term before, but I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago and heard this. So the scramble technology, meaning that technology that perhaps didn't go through that much more ideal vetting process within your organization, but one that just had to happen very, very quickly in order for your company to continue to service the needs of whatever industry you're in. Where were resources impacted? Where did you have staff that potentially were furloughed because you didn't really have any opportunities to have them do something else that would have helped be a benefit to your organization during a remote working structure? Where was paper relied on? Again, in terms of culturally, I know we've heard the terms paper light, paperless for many, many years. I think the proof was really in the pandemic pudding in terms of whether people actually acted and operated within a paperless or paper light mindset. And lastly, where were the pain points, both from a departmental perspective, an internal perspective? Where were your internal customers feeling the pinch? Where were your external customers feeling the pinch? And I can tell you that even though it's the last bullet, it's certainly the most critical in terms of selling your IG program, because if you can tie some solution that you would have been able to offer to the pain point of those who help make your company profitable, you have as much as signed that check that you need in order for that particular technology, person, process, what have you, to be in place. So it's important to be prepared for the next normal. I know new normal became a very overused term. Next normal, I think now is starting to become a more overused term, but the reality is there will be no such thing as a new normal or next normal. It will constantly be changing. The pandemic is just one example of how your organizational structure can change at a moment's notice, but certainly it's not the only way that your organization can get impacted. So be prepared. Think about it from a remote working perspective. Know that there may be times where you've got departments that are in all the time, or they're working in that hybrid, whatever hybrid means to that particular organization. Know that there are going to be potential all-in days, and use those opportunities to really have those face-to-face interactions to the extent that you need to be face-to-face with somebody as opposed to Zoom or Teams or what have you. think about the fact that geography is really expanding for your organization on a daily basis, especially as your organization allows people to work in cities or states or countries that you don't necessarily at present have a home base in, or even a brick and mortar location in. So it's certainly important to understand that you not just have to worry about things like applicable privacy laws, but also making sure that you remain connected with those individuals in terms of this is how you are to store our organization's records. And what that means as it relates to them not following the policies and processes that they were expected to follow when they were in the office 5 days a week. If it ain't broke, don't get rid of it. So again, when you think of tools that may have been put in place during the pandemic that have ultimately allowed your organization to be much more flexible in terms of where they work, how they access information, how they service client and customer needs, don't look at ways to sunset those as the pandemic starts to wane. Again, those particular tools have already shown their abilities and benefits to make you a much more versatile and adaptable firm or organization. By all means, make sure that you continue to promote those tools, even if you have to promote them via different means. And as I mentioned, make sure you let people know how things have gotten better or how they could be better through your IG organization and program. This is the benefit that you provided pre-2020. This is the benefit that you were able to provide 2020 to 2022-ish. And then not knowing what 2022, 2023 and beyond will look like for the world, the organization, anything. Look for opportunities to say, these are the ways that we can be adaptable and prepared for whatever our next situation is. And also ensure that your team is aware of the fact that they play a critical part in making that benefit remain in place. So, ensure that your team is acting as salespeople for your program, as opposed to just soldiers under you as the main leader. Also ensure that people are aware of the fact that records certainly will change based on what expectations they have and how they are relying on information to be delivered to them. So it should always be a two-way conversation. Make sure that they know you are always willing and ready to hear how you can make their access to information much more accessible and beneficial than it may have been in the past. So for those of you who just listened to me go on for the past roughly 40 minutes and are saying, that's all well and good, but how else can I measure the program beyond what the pandemic may have taught us? Certainly know that there's other opportunities. The maturity models that are available, certainly you have an opportunity to say, this is where we are versus this is where we could be. Using surveys that may already be sent out in your organization in terms of how different teams are doing, but potentially new surveys in terms of what does our new world look like, what would really be helpful for you as you continue to service our clients and customers. Looking for metrics to say, this is where we really need to focus our attention and effort, where, for example, are physical records still being created on a much more significant level than otherwise should be, and where are there opportunities for electronic records management practices, digitization processes, staffing, what have you. Calculate, of course, the cost savings that you have in terms of the reduction of inefficient efforts and processes, but also make sure that you're calculating the efficiencies. How much more accessible is data and information in situations where somebody should have access to that information? And where could it be with new tool, new technology, new process, what have you? So that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions?
Oh, yes, we have lots of questions.
Oh, okay.
Let me start. How do you deal with attorneys storing records and work products outside your document management system, especially third-party cloud storage providers such as Google Drive or Box?
So in terms of policies, absolutely all of that should be in your baked into your policy in terms of where people are allowed to store data versus not. To the extent that you are aware of those repositories existing, I would make sure that you work with your compliance team to have conversations with that respective attorney to make sure that he, she, or they is aware of where that data ultimately needs to be stored when the matter concludes. And that's assuming, of course, that that data is allowed to be stored in that particular repository during the course of the matter, meaning that there's been an agreed upon, or a mutual understanding, let's say, between your firm and the client that that particular repository is to be used during the course of the active matter. Providing training is certainly important, especially to those who provide assistance to that attorney, but also having your own staff trained to work with that attorney to get that information out of that particular repository into the appropriate one. So as an example, we do have one particular client who requires their matter team to use a particular repository. We are aware of that, and we work with that attorney to ensure that as that matter or those matters close, that the information is being moved out of that repository into our own DMS to the extent that it needs to be, and that the other material is either being managed by the client or being deleted if it's no longer required to be retained legally.
Great. Did Morgan Lewis have the manpower to offer digitization to the attorneys at the beginning of the pandemic, or did you have to move resources around to accomplish that?
So we did have the resources in terms of our larger roadmap was always to have our traditional record staff transition to more of a digitization program, meaning those who handled the physical records, indexing of physical record storage retrieval, ultimately that their responsibilities would slowly transition to more digitization. Admittedly, the pandemic fast-tracked that. It's funny, we had implemented a digitization program in 6 offices prior to 2020, and we were doing it on an office-by-office basis, again, very slow and steady, and then it was, here it is, the digitization program's available for everybody, which actually worked out pretty well because it gave us the opportunity to do larger training for our essential personnel in terms of the technology that we had available, the expectations of what were we to do after a document had been digitized, but also it allowed us to really market the digitization program through a few different ways. So prior to the pandemic, we said, here's a digitization program. This is what we're going to be doing with your records, which to some extent people acknowledged and understood, but kind of did what they were always doing. We called it a digital workplace, meaning we use the IG and digital to really kind of bold IG practices to say, hey, Joe or Jane, I know you were planning on getting in your car and coming in to get something. Don't. We can digitize it for you. So in some ways, we were able to make it more a scan-on-demand service as well, which it sounds silly because it's all under the digitization umbrella, but we were able to train our team members in those kind of one-off situations to understand when the larger program was rolled out, how they needed to do the process soup to nuts, including quality assurance, what have you.
I like the IG inside digital. That's a good one. I like that. When your IG staff receives a request to produce off-site physical records, do you reply something like, are you sure what you need doesn't exist digitally? Or do you just go ahead and recall the requested physical records?
We do. And I know I mentioned a little bit ago about having your team be salespeople rather than soldiers. That is a primary example of what I'm talking about. We have trained our team, regardless of what their role is, to think proactively. So to the question, if somebody says, can you retrieve XYZ file from offsite? We have the records team doing searches within the DMS to say, is this what you're looking for? Because I found it here. And 9 times out of 10, the answer is, yes, it is. To that situation where it isn't, and no, I need the file. It's okay, rather than us delivering the physical file to you, when it comes in, do you mind us digitizing it? And then you can have it accessible through the DMS. For the most part, that has actually been also well received. In some situations, there's still that urgency that people say, no, I need the physical file. And we've been able to address that too by saying, okay, we'll deliver that, but once you're done, we're going to digitize it so that you have it accessible electronically going forward. So that's a big, long way of saying we do that proactive communication, but that communication is being done by all levels of our team, not just at a managerial or director level, but from everybody, so that we all are saying the same message.
Got it. And I have a question for me personally related to that. If you have a bunch of boxes that were stored offsite that have no information about what the contents are, the sensitivity, all is the age that the box was put into inventory. I've been recommending that we destroy the box because you couldn't possibly know the value of the box, and there are far too many that you would bring back to actually look at the contents of what's in the box. Have you personally experienced that, and what have you done in order to address that?
So we have experienced that, especially for boxes that were created multiple years ago. We are a much more, from a risk perspective, conservative organization, such that we have been calling them back to really identify what the materials are and get them indexed in our system. I'm not saying you absolutely should do that. I'm saying that's based on the risk flavor of our own organization. Certainly, I have worked in and I'm aware of other organizations that say, I think it's defensible for us to not have to go through that exercise and to get rid of it. So I would suggest work with your general counsel's office, explain the situation, and get their guidance as to what they are willing to sign off on in terms of that process.
Great, thank you. Another question. What risks would using personal devices to hosting company tools in a post-pandemic transformation world? How might a BYOB policy address it?
So, good question. By all means, to the extent that your organization has a containerized solution, I think it's really important to work to ensure that your policies establish the fact that containerized solution and the applications approved by your organization are the only ones that should be storing data related to your internal and external matters. I know some tools, quite frankly, already have that baked into place where you can't move data in and out or even copy data in and out of those particular applications, which is great. But at a high level, absolutely, mobility should be baked. Your BYOD program should be baked into your IG policy, but also ensuring that people are aware of the fact that those solutions, to the extent that your organization offers them, are already in place to allow them to work from their mobile devices while still adhering to the firm's security, privacy, and other restrictions.
Okay, great. That's it for the questions that were submitted. I don't know if anyone else has any questions. If they want to ask verbally, or Hutch, I would turn it back over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much. Those were great questions, and Brianne, that was fantastic. I think what I really liked, what hit me there, I love the salesperson versus soldier. I think that was a really good term, really good description, and that's what I like to have for my record people also, to really try to get people to use the tools that we have. And because we are moving away from paper, That is true. So I think that was really informative. And once again, thank you very much. We're now going to take a break and we're going to reconvene at 10:45. And I would like for you to, once again, send your questions to Suzanne. She'll be taking the questions for our next topic. That's topic number 2, information governance benchmarking. So please send your questions to Suzanne, and we will reconvene at 10:45. Thank you.